The rain over Sydney fell in a relentless, gray sheet, turning the soil at Rookwood Cemetery into a thick, clinging mud that seemed to pull at my very soul. I was 73 years old, and as I stood over the fresh earth that now concealed Eleanor, my wife of 45 years, I felt as though the world had simply ceased to revolve. For 4 decades and a half, we had built a quiet, steady life together in Paddington, sharing every morning cup of tea and every quiet worry. Now, there was only the sound of the storm and the crushing weight of an empty future. The crowd of mourners had long since departed, seeking the refuge of their warm vehicles, leaving me alone with my grief. That was when I heard the sharp, impatient clicking of high heels against the wet pavement behind me. It was Chloe, the woman my son, Liam, had married 5 years ago. I did not need to turn to recognize the cadence of her stride. Even on this day, beneath the somber sky, she carried herself with the frantic, calculated energy of a woman perpetually late for a high-stakes board meeting. She wore a tailored black designer dress that cost more than my first sedan, and she held a massive, custom-made umbrella that shielded her perfectly styled hair from the elements. She did not offer a hand of comfort, nor did she speak a word of sympathy for the woman who had welcomed her into our home with nothing but open arms. She simply stopped beside me and released a loud, audible sigh, an expression of irritation that felt like a slap in the face. "You need to start packing your belongings tonight, Arthur," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any human warmth. "Liam and I have already secured a place for you in an assisted living facility on the other side of the county. I have the documents prepared. The movers will be here on Monday morning, so do not make this a difficult process." I kept my gaze fixed on the sodden grass atop Eleanor's grave. I did not move. I did not react. Chloe stepped closer, invading my space, her presence marked by an overwhelming, cloying scent of expensive perfume that smelled like artificiality. "Did you hear me, Arthur?" she snapped, leaning in so I could feel the heat of her impatience. "You are not staying in the Paddington house. It is far too large for a retired tax auditor who can no longer even remember where he places his spectacles. Liam and I have plans for the property. Pack your things and prepare to leave." She viewed me as nothing more than a fragile, confused old man, a relic of the past who was suffering from cognitive decline and was therefore completely defenseless. She thought I was simply a man who spent his days tending to the garden and talking to the birds in the park. That was the persona I had maintained for the last 2 decades. I played the part with absolute precision because it kept my family safe and kept the prying eyes of the world away. Chloe had no idea who she was truly speaking to. She did not know that before I adopted the quiet life of a pensioner, I was a senior forensic investigator for the Australian Taxation Office. I had spent my prime years dismantling sophisticated money laundering rings and outmaneuvering the most arrogant corporate criminals in the country. I possessed an innate ability to read the patterns of human greed, and looking at Chloe, I saw a predator who believed herself to be invisible. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a defense. I simply let the Sydney rain wash over me, maintaining a silence that seemed to infuriate her even further. She opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but before she could speak, a heavy, calloused hand clamped firmly onto my shoulder. It was Daryl, my neighbor of 30 years, a man of few words and a loyalty that could not be shaken. He stood tall, his eyes fixed on Chloe with a quiet, menacing authority. The storm was just beginning, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the cold, sharp focus of my former life return to my mind. "The man just buried his wife, Chloe," Daryl growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the sound of the rain. "Back off before I forget my manners, and remove that umbrella from the equation." Chloe scoffed, her face twisting into a mask of pure, aristocratic disgust. She looked at us as if we were a stain on the pristine pavement of the cemetery. "You people are all the same," she muttered, turning on her heel with a flick of her designer skirt. "Be ready by Monday morning, Arthur, or I will have the authorities remove you by force." She marched away, her silhouette fading into the deluge toward the sleek luxury vehicle where Liam sat waiting, his face obscured by the darkened glass. Daryl did not let me watch her go. With a firm, steadying grip on my arm, he guided me toward his rusted utility truck parked on the perimeter of the cemetery grounds. He opened the passenger door and helped me inside, shielding my head from the driving rain. I expected Daryl to drive me back to the quiet, tree-lined streets of Paddington, to the empty house that had once been a home, so I could sit in the silence and process the finality of the morning. But when he ignited the engine, he did not turn toward the inner city. Instead, he merged onto the M4 motorway, heading steadily westward toward the industrial fringes of Sydney. We drove in complete silence for nearly 40 minutes. The rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers was the only sound, a hypnotic pulse that seemed to beat in time with the racing of my heart. "Where are we going, Daryl?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse, worn thin by the exhaustion of the morning. Daryl kept his eyes fixed on the slick road, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He did not answer me immediately. He drove deep into a maze of dormant factories and forgotten warehouses in Alexandria, where the polished facade of the city seemed to dissolve into rusted steel and gray concrete. He pulled the truck up to a dilapidated brick building, its paint peeling in long, desiccated strips and a heavy steel roller door guarding the entrance. He killed the engine, and the cabin was suddenly filled with an oppressive, heavy quiet. Daryl reached into the depths of his jacket pocket and pulled out a single, heavy brass key. He held it in his palm for a moment, looking down at it as if it were a relic of great and terrible importance, before reaching across to place it in my hand. "Eleanor came to my house a month ago," Daryl said, his voice heavy with a weight that went beyond mere sorrow. "It was right after the specialists told her the cancer had metastasized. She was weak, barely able to walk, but her eyes, Arthur, her eyes were burning with a terrifying, absolute clarity. She handed me this key. She made me swear on my life and my honor that if she did not survive the winter, I would bring you to this exact location immediately after they laid her to rest." I took the cold brass key, staring at the metal in my palm in utter bewilderment. "Why didn't she just tell me?" I asked, the confusion rising in my chest like bile. "Because she knew you would try to stop her," Daryl replied, turning to look me directly in the eyes. "She said, 'This is something only Arthur can know.' She was very specific. 'You must never tell Liam about this place. Not until you understand exactly what you are dealing with.' She told me, 'Liam is completely blind to the snake sleeping in his bed.'" My heart hammered against my ribs with the force of a trapped animal. The long-dormant instincts of the forensic investigator, the bloodhound I had been before I became a husband and a father, suddenly awoke, screaming in the dark. I opened the truck door and stepped out into the freezing Sydney rain. I walked toward the heavy steel door of the warehouse, my hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the sudden, chilling realization that my gentle, unassuming Eleanor had been living a life I had never even begun to imagine. I slid the brass key into the rusted padlock, and with a soft, resonant click, the door yielded, ready to reveal the secrets my wife had carried to her grave. I slid the brass key into the rusted padlock, and with a smooth, unexpected grace, it yielded. I pushed the heavy metal door upward, the rusty tracks groaning in a protest that echoed through the empty industrial lot of Alexandria. As the steel sheet ascended, a rush of stale, trapped air greeted me, carrying the faint scent of ozone and aging paper. I fumbled for the light switch on the concrete wall, my fingers brushing against cold, gritty brick before finding the toggle. A row of fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed into life, flickering violently before settling into a steady hum. I took a single step inside and stopped, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. The heavy brass key slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor with a sound that felt deafening in the stillness. This was not a storage space for forgotten holiday decorations or old furniture. It was a war room. The entire back wall of the warehouse was dominated by a series of massive corkboards, interconnected by a complex web of thin red string that stretched like the veins of a living creature. Every inch of the cork was plastered with documents. There were high-resolution prints of emails, highlighted statements from banks in the Cayman Islands, legal contracts bearing forged signatures, and dozens of surveillance photographs documenting meetings in secluded cafes. It was a meticulously charted financial conspiracy, mapped out with the precision of a master auditor. And there, pinned under the stark glare of a dedicated spotlight in the absolute center, was a large, high-definition photograph of Chloe. I walked toward the wall, my movements mechanical. My professional eyes, honed by decades of hunting down the most elusive embezzlers, began to scan the evidence. I saw wire transfer receipts with routing numbers that traced back to shell companies I had never heard of. I saw the architectural blueprints for a medical startup that belonged to my son, Liam, blueprints that had been altered to strip him of his intellectual property rights. My sweet, gentle Eleanor, who spent her days in Paddington tending to her roses and knitting blankets for the church, had not been quietly waiting to die. For the last 2 years, while the cancer slowly ravaged her body, she had been systematically constructing a federal-level fraud case against her own daughter-in-law. She had been investigating Chloe in absolute, agonizing silence, gathering the ammunition I would need to wage a war I did not even know had begun. Resting on a small, scarred metal desk directly beneath the center of the wall was a silver digital voice recorder. A small strip of white tape was affixed to its side, with my name written in Eleanor's elegant, unmistakable cursive handwriting. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the weight of her final secret resting in my palm. This was the sanctuary she had built, a silent fortress erected to protect our son from the woman he believed was his partner. As I stood in the harsh, buzzing light, I realized that the house in Paddington had not been our only home. The real heart of our family's defense had been hidden here, in the shadows of an Alexandria warehouse, kept alive by the quiet, fierce love of a woman who refused to let her family be destroyed. I pressed the play button on the silver digital recorder, my thumb hovering over the stop function as if afraid to unleash the truth. The small, internal speaker crackled to life, and Eleanor's voice, hollowed by pain and the labored breath of a woman whose lungs were failing, filled the cavernous warehouse. Her tone was not the soft, melodic murmur I heard every morning over our tea. It was cold, sharp, and possessed a terrifying clarity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Arthur, my love," she began, her voice echoing off the concrete walls like a ghost speaking from beyond the veil. "If you are listening to this, I am already gone, and you are standing in the sanctuary I built for us. I am deeply sorry for keeping this secret for 2 years. I knew that if I told you what I was doing, you would have insisted on handling it yourself, or worse, you would have tried to shield me from the strain. I needed you to be my husband, not my investigator, during those final days. I could not let the toxicity of the evil sleeping under Liam's roof poison the time we had left together." I closed my eyes, picturing her sitting at our kitchen table in Paddington, knitting or reading while her mind was secretly tracing the complex patterns of Chloe's deceit. "Chloe is not just a social climber, Arthur," she continued, her voice gaining a desperate, fierce momentum. "She is a parasite. She is systematically bleeding Liam dry. You know how hard Liam has worked for the past 5 years to develop that revolutionary medical patent? He believes Chloe has been helping him secure venture capital, but she has done the opposite. She has been forging his signature, legally transferring the ownership of his life's work into a dummy corporation she controls. That corporation is secretly owned by a man named Marcus, the director of the investment fund Chloe claims to represent. She has been having an affair with him for over 2 years. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, agonizing thud. Liam had poured his entire soul, every waking moment, into that medical device. It was his dream, his contribution to the world, and this woman was plotting to rip it from his hands and hand it over to her lover like a prize. "But that is not all," Eleanor whispered, her voice hitching with a painful, rattling cough that I knew all too well. "Chloe knows we own our home in Paddington outright. She knows its value has skyrocketed. She is planning to have you declared legally incompetent. She intends to force you into a state-run facility to steal the house and liquidate our life savings. She thinks that because you are quiet and aging, you are defenseless, a foolish old tax auditor who no longer remembers where he puts his glasses." There was a long, haunting pause on the recording. I could hear the faint, steady beep of a pulse oximeter in the background, a sound from our final weeks together that I had tried so hard to forget. When she spoke again, her voice carried a command that chilled my blood. "Show her how wrong she is, Arthur. My sweet husband, my hero, do not let her win. Dig up the bloodhound you buried all those years ago. Use your skills, use your mind, and absolutely destroy her." The recording ended with a soft, final click. The warehouse returned to its oppressive silence, but inside me, a dormant fire had been reignited. Eleanor had not spent her final days just dying. She had been preparing for war. She had given me the keys to her justice, and as I stood amidst the red strings and the cold, hard facts of Chloe's betrayal, I knew that the retired tax auditor was gone. The bloodhound was awake, and he was ready to hunt. The warehouse fell into a profound silence, but my mind was anything but quiet. The grief that had shackled me since the funeral began to recede, replaced by the cold, methodical clarity of a professional hunter. For 25 years, I had successfully worn the mask of a harmless, slightly forgetful pensioner. I had cultivated this identity with the same care one might give to a bonsai tree, ensuring that no one, not even Liam, suspected that the man who tended the garden in Paddington was once the most lethal forensic auditor in the ATO's history. I paced the concrete floor, my footsteps echoing against the walls, my thoughts shifting into the rapid-fire logic that had defined my prime. In the 1990s, I was known as the Bloodhound. I did not carry a weapon. I carried a calculator and a terrifying intuition for financial deception. I had spent my career unraveling international money laundering rings, dismantling corporate shells that were designed to hide billions, and sending untouchable white-collar criminals to prison. I had walked away from that world when Liam fell ill with his bone disease, choosing the predictability of a quiet life over the high-stakes, 80-hour workweeks of federal investigations. I had buried that part of myself so deeply that even I had begun to forget it existed. But Eleanor had remembered. She had seen the man behind the cardigan and the orthopedic shoes. She knew that the bloodhound was not dead. He was simply sleeping. Standing amidst her evidence, I felt the sharp, intoxicating surge of that old adrenaline. I walked over to the desk and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive I had kept taped beneath the drawer, a contingency I had prepared decades ago, just in case. My strategy began to take shape with ruthless efficiency. First, I needed to know the extent of Marcus's reach. If he was collaborating with Chloe, he was likely the one managing the illicit flow of capital. I knew how to map a corporate architecture. I could spot the cracks in a ledger from a mile away. I didn't need to shout or make a scene. My weapon was data. I would need to access the ATO's secure servers to cross-reference the shell company's tax footprints against Marcus's private investment portfolio. It was a violation of protocol that could land me in prison, but as I looked at the photograph of my son's stolen patent, I knew that the law was a tool for those who sought justice, and I was going to use it to ensure they had none. I packed the silver recorder and a handful of key documents into my coat pocket. My hands were no longer trembling. They were steady, precise, and ready. I locked the heavy steel door behind me and walked back into the freezing Sydney rain. As I climbed into Daryl's truck, the man looked at me, sensing the change in my posture. He saw the sharpness in my eyes, a look he hadn't seen in the 30 years we'd been neighbors. "Everything all right, Arthur?" Daryl asked, his voice low. "Everything is going to be all right, Daryl," I replied, my voice deep and devoid of the frailty I had been performing for Chloe. "I am going home now to play the role of the confused old man one last time. But after that, the hunt begins." As we drove back through the dark, wet streets toward the suburbs, I began to calculate. I was no longer an observer in my own tragedy. I was the architect of my own justice. Chloe thought she was playing a game of chess against a blind opponent, but she had failed to realize that the person she was playing against had written the rules of the game herself. By the time I reached my driveway in Paddington, the bloodhound was fully awake, and I was already preparing the trap that would systematically dismantle every lie Chloe and Marcus had ever told. I returned to the Paddington house, the weight of the key in my pocket serving as a heavy anchor to the truth. The house, usually a sanctuary of shared history, now felt like a stage set, a carefully constructed environment where I had played the role of the frail, grieving widower for Chloe's benefit. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway. The air inside was still and cool, smelling faintly of the lavender Eleanor had loved. Just as I hung my coat, a jarring, metallic crash erupted from the back of the house, followed by the sound of splintering timber. It came from my private study, the room where I kept our family albums, historical tax records, and the few mementos I had preserved from my years at the ATO. I moved down the hallway with a soft, practiced silence, my footsteps barely registering on the hardwood. I rounded the corner to see Chloe standing before the study door. She was still wearing the black designer dress from the funeral, but she had discarded her high heels, leaving her standing in her stockinged feet. In her hand, she held a heavy iron crowbar from my own garden shed. She was bracing herself, ready to force the lock, her face a mask of impatient, predatory entitlement. She was tearing into our private life on the very day we had consigned Eleanor to the earth, lacking even a shred of common human decency. I cleared my throat, a gentle, almost pathetic sound, but in the quiet hallway, it sliced through the air like a blade. Chloe gasped and spun around, the crowbar clattering loudly onto the floorboards. For a fleeting second, the predatory mask faltered, and I saw a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic in her eyes. She had been caught in the act of desecrating the sanctuary of a man she deemed a senile pensioner. However, the panic was brief. She quickly straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing as she realized who was standing before her. She did not bother with an excuse. There was no attempt at a fake apology. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared at me with profound, elitist disgust. "What are you doing, Chloe?" I asked, my voice pitched to a weak, tremulous tremor, perfectly mirroring the persona she expected. I let my shoulders slump, widening my eyes to mimic the confused, fading consciousness of a man lost in his own grief. She did not flinch. She simply pointed a manicured finger toward the study door. "I am looking for the property deeds and the bank statements, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with cold, clinical authority. "Don't try to play the victim. The psychiatrist is coming tomorrow morning to assess your mental state, and I need to ensure that the financial transition goes smoothly. You are completely powerless here. Your mind is failing, and if I have to break down every door in this house to secure our future, I will." I looked at her, watching the way her eyes darted toward the study, and I felt a flicker of cold satisfaction. She was moving too fast, fueled by a greed so intense it had blinded her to the very real possibility that I was not the man she thought I was. She was already mentally liquidating our life's work, already spending the inheritance she had spent years trying to secure. I shuffled past her, dragging my feet heavily to maintain the illusion of my decline, and began to mutter incoherent, pathetic apologies about finding Eleanor. "I am sorry, Chloe," I stammered, my voice cracking. I thought she was in there. I am just so tired." She watched me with a sneer, a look of utter triumph spreading across her face. She was completely convinced that she had total control. She did not know that as I walked past the study, my hand had brushed against the door frame, feeling for the tiny, high-definition microcamera I had installed earlier that morning. It was recording every word, every aggressive gesture, and every admission of her criminal intent. She thought she was winning, but she was merely walking deeper into the trap I had set. I shuffled toward the living room, a broken old man, while in the shadows of my mind, the bloodhound was already closing the net. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Paddington house was thick with an artificial, oppressive stillness. I sat in my faded armchair, draped in a heavy wool cardigan, watching the fireplace as if the cold ashes held some profound answer. Chloe entered the living room with the aggressive, measured gait of a predator who believed the kill was already hers. Behind her, she led a man I had never met, a balding, nervous individual clutching a worn leather clipboard. He was not a doctor, nor a medical evaluator. He had the shifting, restless eyes of a bottom-feeding solicitor who specialized in liquidating estates for pennies on the dollar. Chloe did not offer a greeting. She strode past me as if I were a piece of discarded furniture. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the antique mahogany cabinet in the corner, a piece that had held Eleanor's most precious belongings for over 4 decades. "Write all of this down," Chloe commanded, her voice ringing with an elitist disdain that made the very air seem brittle. "Do not bother with individual appraisals for the silver or the porcelain. It is all just dated junk. Lump it together as a single estate lot. We need this entire house emptied, sanitized, and ready for listing by the end of the week." The solicitor nodded fervently, his pen scratching against the paper with a sound like dry insects. He walked over to the cabinet and tapped the glass with his pen, calculating how quickly he could turn my family's history into a quick payout. I sat perfectly still, my hands trembling slightly in my lap, performing the role of the heavily medicated senior citizen to absolute perfection. Chloe glanced down at me, a cold, victorious smirk playing on her lips. She believed she had already conquered the landscape of my life. She thought the legal documents I had been forced to sign yesterday, which I had meticulously prepared to be legally void, gave her supreme control. What she did not know was that while she had been sleeping in the guest room, I had spent the night transforming my quiet Paddington home into a high-tech federal surveillance trap. Hidden inside the smoke detector, the bookshelves, and even the intricate woodwork of the china cabinet, I had placed 6 military-grade microcameras. They were recording every syllable, every arrogant gesture, and every piece of criminal evidence she was currently providing with such arrogant generosity. She was openly conspiring to steal my assets on high-definition video, providing me with the final, ironclad ammunition I needed. I slowly pushed myself up from the armchair, letting my knees buckle just enough to keep her deceived. I kept my head down, adopting a look of profound, pathetic submission. "I am going to the kitchen," I mumbled, my voice weak and raspy, the sound of a man drowning in his own fog. "Would you and your guest like a cup of tea, Chloe?" Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh, glancing at the solicitor with eyes full of contempt. "Look at him," she sneered, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing only a few feet away. Yesterday he was acting like a disoriented nuisance, and today he wants to play the perfect host. The dementia is clearly rotting his brain. She turned back to me, her eyes hard and devoid of any human empathy. "Make the tea, Arthur. And make it quick. I have a schedule to keep, and you have a lifetime of packing to do before the transport arrives tomorrow." I shuffled slowly toward the kitchen, dragging my feet against the floorboards to maintain the illusion of my decline. Once I was behind the kitchen counter, hidden from her direct line of sight, the trembling in my hands ceased entirely. My posture straightened, and the cold, analytical energy of the investigator returned. I prepared the tea with deliberate, precise movements, not for hospitality, but to steady my own resolve. I was setting the stage for a psychological strike. I knew that in this final act, I didn't need physical force. I only needed to let her arrogance provide the leverage that would finally bring the entire ceiling down upon her head. I carried the tray back into the living room, my hands rattling the porcelain cups with practiced fragility, ready to whisper the name that would start the unraveling of her world. I approached Chloe, the silver tray rattling with the rhythm of my practiced frailty. She stood by the bay window, her gaze fixed on the front lawn, already mentally redesigning the garden once I was safely tucked away in a facility. The solicitor was busy tapping the walls, testing the structural integrity of the home they intended to liquidate. I stopped beside her, allowing her to look down on me from her height of arrogant power. She reached out and took a cup from the tray, sipping it with casual entitlement, completely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on the precipice of her own destruction. I looked up at her, my eyes wide and filmed with a convincing, clouded haze. Then, without abandoning my fragile posture or raising my raspy voice, I dropped the name that would shatter her composure. "Are you absolutely certain," I asked, my tone as light and airy as a comment on the afternoon weather, "that Marcus is going to give you the 50% equity he promised you?" The reaction was instantaneous and profound. Chloe froze. The porcelain teacup stopped halfway to her lips, and the color drained from her face, leaving her skin a startling, ghostly shade of ash. Her eyes widened, not with the typical confusion of a civilian, but with the raw, primal terror of a predator who has suddenly realized the hunter is behind her. The name Marcus was not merely an association. It was the key to the entire offshore structure she and her lover had spent years building in secrecy. There was no logical reason for a frail, aging pensioner in Paddington to know that name, let alone the precise details of an illicit corporate equity agreement. Her mind collided with the impossibility of my knowledge, and for a terrifying second, her composure splintered. The teacup in her hand began to tremble, spilling hot tea onto her designer dress, but she did not even register the burn. "What?" she stammered, her voice a high-pitched, breathless squeak. Who told you that name?" She stepped closer, invading my space, desperate to find a sign of weakness or confusion in my eyes, anything to reassure her that she hadn't just been unmasked. I watched her panicked face, and I flawlessly executed the pivot. I let my eyes wander aimlessly toward the ceiling, letting a foolish, vacant smile spread across my face. I tilted my head, looking completely lost in a mental fog. Marcus, I mumbled, scratching the side of my head with a trembling hand. Who is Marcus? I think the neighbor's new dog is named Marcus. Yes, that is it. It is a very loud dog, Chloe. It barks all night long. It makes my head hurt terribly. I shuffled away from her, carrying the tray back toward the kitchen, muttering incoherent nonsense about stray dogs and broken fences. I left her standing perfectly still by the bay window, paralyzed by a massive wave of psychological terror. I had successfully planted the seeds of paranoia deep within her treacherous mind. She could no longer trust her own reality. She was now trapped in a loop of wondering if she had been overheard, if her secure lines had been compromised, or if someone else had been watching her all along. Chloe was no longer a confident predator hunting a victim. She was a terrified, paranoid criminal, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the final, lethal blow to fall. The game had shifted, and she had just begun to realize that she was the one being hunted. Once Chloe and her accomplice had retreated, their hurried departure marked by the screech of tires on the quiet Paddington Street, I abandoned the charade. The frail, stumbling pensioner vanished the moment the heavy front door clicked shut. I strode to my study, my posture perfectly erect, and sat before my primary terminal. It was time to follow the money. In my decades as a senior forensic auditor for the Australian Taxation Office, I had learned a fundamental truth. People can lie with their mouths, and they can forge legal documents, but the numbers never lie. Money always leaves a permanent, irreversible digital footprint. Chloe had connected her laptop to my home wireless network, assuming I lacked the technical proficiency to manage a simple router. It took me less than 10 minutes to bypass her rudimentary security firewalls and gain administrative access to her hard drive. I sat in the dim light of the study, my eyes scanning the endless rows of spreadsheets she believed were securely buried. The reality I uncovered made my blood run cold. Chloe was not merely planning to steal Liam's medical patent. She was systematically burying him under a mountain of crippling debt to finance Marcus's failing investment schemes. I pulled up a series of high-interest business loan applications. Chloe had stolen Liam's tax identification number, forged his digital signature, and secured over $500,000 in toxic loans, leveraging the very laboratory equipment Liam used to build his prototypes. She was using my son's stolen credit to keep her lover's arrogant empire afloat. My concentration was shattered by the ringing of my cellular phone. It was a video call from Liam. I took a steadying breath, allowing the cold, analytical energy of the investigator to recede just enough to let the supportive father emerge. I answered, softening my eyes. "Hey there, my boy," I said, my voice gentle and slightly raspy. Liam's face appeared on the screen, looking utterly devastated. He was sitting in his commercial lab, surrounded by stacks of unpaid invoices. "It's all falling apart, Dad," he whispered, his voice heavy with despair. "The company accounts are draining. The suppliers are calling every morning, and I cannot figure out where the capital is going. I feel like I'm losing my mind." Every word was a rusted blade twisting in my gut. He was blaming himself, questioning his own competence while the woman sleeping in his bed was actively dismantling his life. I wanted to scream the truth, but the bloodhound knew that revealing it prematurely would be catastrophic. If I told him everything now, he would confront Chloe, and she would simply destroy the evidence and vanish, leaving Liam with a massive debt and a broken heart. I needed to construct an ironclad trap first. "You are a brilliant man, Liam," I told him, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "Do not let this darkness convince you to surrender your dream. Just hold on until the weekend. Promise me you will not sign any new contracts today." He sighed, looking at the floor before meeting my gaze. "Okay, Dad. I'll hold on until the weekend. I love you." I ended the call and placed the phone on the desk. The sadness in my chest vanished, instantly replaced by a lethal, focused resolve. They thought they could treat my son like a disposable asset. They thought they could steal his brilliant mind and leave him bankrupt while they celebrated their stolen success. They had made a fatal miscalculation. I was no longer merely going to stop them from liquidating our home. I was going to systematically dismantle Marcus's entire corporate structure, seize his assets, and ensure that by the time this was over, there would be nothing left of their arrogant empire but dust. The hunt had officially escalated, and they had no idea the hounds were already at their door. The towering glass and steel structure of the primary financial district bank in Sydney loomed over the busy streets, a monument to the city's corporate power and untouchable wealth. It was the premier investment house, handling the private fortunes of the elite, including the predatory investment funds managed by Marcus. I parked my modest sedan a few blocks away and walked slowly toward the grand entrance. I was dressed precisely for the role I needed to play. A faded brown wool cardigan, worn corduroy trousers, and scuffed orthopedic walking shoes, the perfect disguise for a fragile 73-year-old pensioner who had wandered far from the quiet comfort of his suburban porch. I pushed through the revolving glass doors into a lobby that smelled of expensive imported coffee and success. The air was frigid, contrasting sharply with the humid Sydney morning. As I shuffled my feet across the pristine marble, the bustling noise of the room noticeably dipped. Wealthy clients and sharp young executives glanced at me with expressions of mild confusion or outright disdain, deciding I was a nuisance, a mistake, a piece of detritus that had blown in through the front door. I walked directly to the marble reception desk. The young woman behind the monitor wore a condescending smile. Before I could speak, she held up a manicured hand and spoke in the slow, exaggerated tone one uses for a confused child. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I think you're in the wrong building. The retail branch for your pension inquiries is 2 streets down. This is exclusively for corporate and high-net-worth clients." I did not raise my voice. I kept my shoulders slumped and my hands resting gently on the counter. "I am in the exact right building, miss," I replied, my voice a soft, raspy whisper. "I need to speak with the managing director of corporate acquisitions. I believe his name is Richard Croft. Tell him Arthur Sullivan is here, and that he has 3 minutes to clear his schedule." The receptionist laughed, but when she tapped the name into her terminal, the arrogant smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her cheeks, and she stared at the screen, her mouth slightly agape. She did not say another word. She picked up her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the executive floor. 5 minutes later, I stood inside the sprawling penthouse office of Richard Croft. The room was breathtaking, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the harbor. Croft, a man in his late 50s wearing a $3,000 Italian suit, stood behind his desk looking intensely irritated. He had been forced to cancel a meeting, and he was clearly furious that the priority override had come from a shabby pensioner. "Look, I don't know what kind of glitch you triggered in our system," Croft barked, leaning his knuckles against the desk. "But I handle billions. State your business and get out, or I'll have security escort you." For the first time, I dropped the persona. I straightened my spine, instantly growing taller. I rolled my shoulders back, releasing the tension of the fragile old man. When I looked into his eyes, the pensioner was gone, and the bloodhound was staring right through him. "I am not here to waste your time, Richard," I said, my voice dropping into the deep, cold, commanding baritone that had once terrified boardrooms across the country. "I am here to save you from spending the rest of your miserable life in a federal prison." I reached into my cardigan and pulled out a solid black polycarbonate credentials case. I flipped it open and tossed it onto his desk. The brass shield gleamed in the sunlight, bearing the official seal of the Australian Taxation Office, alongside my identification stamped with the highest level clearance. Croft's world shattered. A level 8 clearance was not for standard auditors. It was for the elite investigators who hunted global syndicates. It gave me the supreme legal authority to freeze an entire banking institution with a single phone call. Croft stumbled backward, landing in his chair, his breathing hitching. I had no idea," he stammered, his corporate vocabulary evaporating. "Preston, Marcus, we run a clean bank. You run a blind bank, Richard." I corrected him sharply, slamming a stack of documents onto the desk. "Marcus and his firm have been funneling hundreds of thousands in fraudulent funds through your commercial accounts for 2 years. He is using your reputation to wash money stolen from the elderly and vulnerable startups. If I make one phone call, the authorities will freeze every asset in this building, and you will be on the front page of every newspaper tomorrow as a co-conspirator." Croft was sweating profusely. He raised his hands defensively. "Please, We will cooperate fully. Tell me what to do. I leaned forward, my hands flat on his desk. You are going to log into your terminal and place a permanent silent federal hold on every account belonging to Marcus. He will not be able to withdraw a single penny, and you will not alert him under any circumstances. Croft tapped the keyboard frantically. It's done, he whispered. What else? I pulled out a certified banking draft, representing every cent Eleanor and I had saved over 45 years. I am buying the entirety of Marcus's corporate debt, I stated coldly. I am the primary creditor now. I want the immediate legal authority to seize all of his assets the very second he defaults. Croft stared at the draft, utterly defeated. He signed the agreements, making the transaction binding. He stood up, abandoning his corporate pride, and executed a subservient bow. It is done, Mr. Sullivan, he whispered. Marcus currently works for you without even knowing it. The evening of the Innovation Gala at the Sydney Opera House arrived with a crisp, cool breeze sweeping off the harbor, masking the suffocating tension that had built within me throughout the week. I stood before the full-length mirror in my Paddington home, dressing not in the cardigan of a pensioner, but in a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit I had kept in a dust-proof garment bag for over 2 decades. It was the armor of the bloodhound, sharp, uncompromising, and designed to command the very air in a room. As I adjusted the crimson silk tie, I didn't see a fragile widower. I saw a man who had finally reclaimed his life from those who sought to trade his legacy for temporary gain. I arrived at the Opera House as the elite of Sydney's corporate world began their procession down the red carpet. I didn't walk with the shuffle of an old man, but with the steady, predatory stride of someone who already held the keys to the kingdom. Entering the grand ballroom, the sheer opulence felt like an insult to the work Liam had done in his garage. Massive chandeliers cast a golden glow over the sea of wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and socialites who were currently sipping champagne, blissfully unaware that the empire they were celebrating was built on systemic fraud. Directly beneath, a towering digital banner for Marcus's investment firm sat the prototype of the medical device Liam had spent 5 agonizing years perfecting. Then I saw them. Standing on the elevated platform in the center of the hall, Marcus wore a tuxedo that screamed of unearned success, while Chloe stood by his side, dripping in diamonds purchased with money she had siphoned from my son. She looked triumphant, her laughter ringing out over the crowd as she prepared to step onto the stage to unveil the stolen patent. I moved through the room with surgical precision, stopping 20 feet from their pedestal. I held the thick, dark brown manila envelope, the document that contained the federal asset seizure order and the proof of Marcus's complete bankruptcy, firmly at my side. Chloe turned her head, and her gaze locked onto mine. The triumphant smile she wore shattered instantly, her face draining of color until she looked like a walking corpse. She whispered something urgently to Marcus, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and white-hot fury. Marcus, fueled by his trademark arrogance, marched toward me, looking for a way to intimidate what he still presumed was a confused old man. "How did you get in here?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous threat. "You pathetic fool. You are ruining the most important night of my life. Get out, or I'll have you dragged out in handcuffs." I didn't answer him. I didn't tremble. I simply looked at him with the cold, unyielding eyes that had once brought global syndicates to their knees. I reached into my jacket and slowly pulled out the envelope. The ballroom seemed to fall into a state of suspended animation as the surrounding crowd sensed the shifting tide. I handed the envelope to Chloe, watching the greedy, involuntary instinct that forced her to snatch it. She tore the seal with trembling fingers, her eyes locking onto the official federal seal of the Australian Taxation Office and the asset seizure order. The look of sheer, unadulterated horror on her face was the final piece of justice I had been building toward. "Everything you claim to own," I said, my voice resonating with a deep, authoritative resonance that carried across the hushed room, "is currently frozen and legally mine. Your company, your assets, and your future, they ended at 3 o'clock this afternoon." As Marcus scrambled to grab the papers, realizing that his debt had been purchased and his accounts drained, the doors at the back of the room burst open. Armed officers from the Australian Federal Police flooded the ballroom, their presence a stark, clinical reality against the luxury of the gala. As they marched toward the platform, Marcus and Chloe turned on each other, their alliance dissolving into a pathetic, violent brawl of mutual recrimination. I stood in the doorway with Liam, who had just arrived, watching as the symphony of their destruction reached its inevitable, beautiful conclusion. The rats were finally being cleared from the house, and for the first time in years, the air felt perfectly, brilliantly clean. The morning sun over Sydney spilled across the kitchen windows of my Paddington home, casting a warmth that felt less like weather and more like a hard-won benediction. The house, once a stage for my performative decline, had returned to its natural, steady rhythm. I stood by the sink, the ceramic mug of black coffee warming my palms, watching the native ferns in the courtyard sway in the breeze. Behind me, the house was quiet, a silence that no longer felt heavy with the weight of unspoken resentment, but instead carried the quiet dignity of a life that had finally been set right. Later that afternoon, Liam arrived, his car pulling into the driveway with a quiet, purposeful crunch of gravel. He was no longer the exhausted, hollowed-out shell of a man I had seen on that video call months ago. He walked up the steps with a confident, measured grace, his eyes bright with the clarity of a man who had reclaimed his own genius. We sat on the back porch, the same porch where I had spent years playing the role of the frail retiree. But today, we were merely father and son, speaking of the present and the future. He had spent the morning finalizing the transition of his company, moving the research facility into a new, state-of-the-art laboratory in Alexandria, where integrity was the absolute cornerstone of every patent. He did not apologize again for the past. The guilt had already been purged during those long, difficult nights we spent untangling the web Chloe had spun. Instead, he simply reached out and placed his hand on mine, a quiet, solid acknowledgement of the path we had traversed together. We never spoke of the gala or the courtroom proceedings. It was a silent pact we had made, an understanding that those events were the final, necessary surgery to remove the rot from our lives. The cracks remained, and the memory of the betrayal would always linger in the periphery, but they were no longer fissures that threatened to shatter us. They were merely the marks of a foundation that had been tested and found resilient. As the sun began to dip behind the Sydney skyline, painting the horizon in hues of soft, bruised gold, I thought of Eleanor. I drove to Rookwood Cemetery just before the gates were closed for the evening. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and distant eucalyptus. I knelt beside her headstone, my movements steady and deliberate, and placed a single white rose against the cool, gray granite. "I did exactly what you asked, my love," I whispered, the wind carrying the words into the quiet twilight. "The house is safe, Liam is thriving, and the people who tried to destroy our world are paying the price for their own greed. You protected us even when you were fading, and you gave me the tools to ensure our family would survive." I did not feel the need to remain a sentinel in the dark. I stood up, brushing the soil from my trousers, and took one final, lingering look at the name engraved in the stone. The bloodhound had long since retired. The man who had orchestrated the dissolution of a corporate empire was gone, replaced by a father who was finally free to simply be. I walked back toward my utility truck, the sound of my footsteps rhythmic and unhurried. As I drove out of the cemetery gates and back toward the city, I realized that true power was never about the titles we held, the authority we wielded, or the wealth we accumulated. It was the simple, profound liberty of being able to wake up in one's own home, knowing that the truth had been spoken, the debt had been paid, and the family was whole once more. The Sydney night was beginning to glow with 1,000 distant lights, but for the first time in years, I was not looking for shadows. I was simply driving home, into the light.